His hand was still on her face when the room realized who was watching. The waitress didn't flinch, didn't speak, didn't beg, and that silence made the mafia boss stop breathing for a second. What happened next wasn't loud, wasn't violent. But someone in that restaurant was already finished. If this story pulled you in, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss what's coming next. I've got another unforgettable story dropping tomorrow. And while you're here, jump into the comments and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing our community from all around the world. All right, let's get back into it. The chandelier-lit silence of La Couronne, where Manhattan's elite whispered their darkest transactions over truffle-dusted plates, and 20-year Bordeaux exploded with the crack of palm against flesh. Stella Hatch's head snapped sideways. The red mark bloomed instantly across her cheek, angry and unmistakable under the warm glow of crystal lights. Her dark hair, pulled back in the regulation style all servers wore, shifted with the force. She didn't stumble, didn't cry out. Her hand remained at her side, fingers loose, not even reaching for her face. The dining room froze mid-breath. Table 12, two hedge fund executives negotiating a merger over Dover Sole stopped with forks suspended. Table 9, a silver-haired woman in diamonds, who'd seen 3 husbands into early graves, set down her wine glass with the careful precision of someone who suddenly understood she was witnessing something dangerous. The sommelier, André, stood motionless near the bar with a bottle of Chateau Margaux tilted at 45 degrees, his mouth half open in a question he'd never finish asking. Fred Hinkle, floor manager of La Couronne, withdrew his hand slowly. He smoothed his navy suit jacket with theatrical precision, as if he'd just completed a necessary correction rather than committed assault. His slicked back hair caught the light as he stepped back, creating distance that felt calculated rather than cautious. "When I tell you to replace a water glass," Fred said, his voice carrying across the silent dining room with practiced authority, "I expect it done immediately, not when you feel like it. Not after you've finished chatting with the kitchen staff." Immediately. Stella said nothing. She straightened her white server's uniform, the kind with the stiff collar and short sleeves that made everyone look vaguely medical, and adjusted the small name tag pinned above her heart. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing remained steady. She looked at Fred with eyes that registered him the way you'd register a stain on the carpet. Unfortunate, but not worth extended contemplation. The fabrication was obvious to anyone paying attention. Stella had replaced that water glass 6 minutes ago. Fred had been watching her all evening, waiting for an excuse, and when none materialized, he'd invented one. But in La Couronne, truth mattered less than hierarchy. Fred took another step back, scanning the room with the confidence of a man who believed proximity to power granted immunity. His gaze swept past the frozen guests, past the terrified servers clustered near the kitchen doors, past the bartender who'd stopped mid-pour. His gaze slid past table 7, and that's where Fred Hinkle made his fatal error. Sebastian Perez sat alone at the corner table, the one positioned to observe the entire dining room without being obviously observed in return. He wore a black suit with no tie, the collar of his shirt open just enough to reveal the edge of a tattoo that crept up from his collarbone, the kind of ink that meant things, that told stories most people weren't cleared to hear. His dark hair was groomed back severely, emphasizing the sharp angles of his face. His expression hadn't changed since the slap. He hadn't flinched, hadn't reacted, hadn't moved at all except to set down his glass of scotch with a control that bordered on ceremonial. Sebastian Perez didn't look angry. He looked interested. His eyes weren't on Fred. They were on Stella. Specifically, on the way she stood, weight balanced, shoulders level, breathing measured. On the way her silence wasn't submission, but calculation. On the red mark spreading across her cheek and the complete absence of tears. Most people, when struck, either collapse or explode. Stella Hatch did neither. She waited. Not the waiting of someone hoping for rescue. The waiting of someone deciding whether a response was worth the energy expenditure. Sebastian had built an empire reading body language faster than most people read headlines. He knew fear, real fear, and this wasn't it. This was something rarer. This was someone who'd already survived worse and filed this incident underhandled. Fred cleared his throat, reclaiming the room's attention. Everyone can return to their meals. The issue is resolved. Slowly, carefully, the dining room began to breathe again. Conversations restarted in hushed tones. Silverware clinked against porcelain. André the sommelier finished his pour with trembling hands. But something had shifted. The guests who really knew what kind of establishment La Couronne was, The ones who understood that this restaurant existed because certain men needed neutral territory to discuss things that couldn't be discussed in offices or homes. Those guests kept glancing at table 7. Sebastian Perez still hadn't moved. Fred gestured toward the kitchen with a sharp flick of his wrist. "Back to work, Stella. And if I see another—" "Excuse me." The voice came from table 7. Not loud, not aggressive, just 2 words delivered with the kind of quiet that made people stop talking immediately. Sebastian Perez was standing now. His movements were economical, precise. He buttoned his suit jacket with one hand, the gesture almost casual. Almost. "Mr. Perez," Fred said, his voice brightening with the desperate cheerfulness of a man suddenly remembering who he was addressing. "I apologize for the disruption. Sometimes staff require firm. Come here." Fred hesitated. It was the first crack in his armor, visible only for a second before he plastered the smile back on and crossed the dining room. He moved with the false confidence of someone who'd convinced himself that being in the same room as powerful men made him powerful by association. He stopped 3 feet from Sebastian's table. Sebastian didn't sit back down. He stood there, studying Fred with the same focus he'd given Stella, but where his observation of her had been assessing, his observation of Fred was diagnostic, like a doctor examining something malignant. "What's your name?" Sebastian asked. "Fred Hinkle, sir. I'm the floor manager here at La Couronne. I've had the pleasure of serving you on several." "The woman you just hit." Fred blinked. "I'm sorry?" "Her name." "Stella Hatch." Fred's smile tightened. "As I mentioned, there was a service issue that required correction. I assure you, we maintain the highest standards. How long has she worked here?" "About 7 months, I believe." "You hired her?" "Yes, sir. I handle all front-of-house staffing." Sebastian nodded slowly. He picked up his scotch, examined it in the light, then set it back down without drinking. "Sit down, Fred." It wasn't a request. Fred sat. And across the dining room, still standing exactly where Fred had left her, Stella Hatch watched with eyes that revealed nothing and understood everything. The room had stopped breathing again. But this time, it wasn't shock keeping everyone silent. It was anticipation. Stella's apartment was a 4th-floor walk-up in Washington Heights, the kind of building where the landlord's promises expired the moment you signed the lease. The radiator clanged like it was being beaten with a pipe. The kitchen faucet dripped in a rhythm that made sleep difficult. And the bedroom door didn't close all the way, a fact that bothered her younger brother Jamie more than it bothered her. She'd stopped caring about privacy around the same time she'd stopped caring about comfort. It was 2:47 a.m. when she finally made it home, her feet screaming in her knockoff work flats, the red mark on her cheek now a dull purple that would take days to fade. She set her keys on the counter with the practiced silence of someone who'd perfected coming home without waking anyone, then checked the envelope tucked behind the microwave. Rent, due in 6 days. The math was simple and brutal. $2,100 for a 1-bedroom that should cost $1,400. But landlords in this city could smell desperation, and desperation paid premium rates. Her tips tonight, even before Fred's performance, had been decent. $340. Add that to what she'd saved, and she was still $890 short. She had 4 more shifts before the first. It would be enough. It had to be enough. Stella opened the refrigerator half empty except for Jamie's insulin, carefully organized on the top shelf, and some leftover rice she'd made 3 days ago. She pulled out the container, ate 2 cold forkfuls standing at the counter, then put it back. Appetite was a luxury, and luxuries required justification. The bedroom door was cracked open. She could see Jamie's form under the blankets, the rise and fall of his breathing steady. 17 years old and already carrying more medical debt than most adults would see in a lifetime. Type 1 diabetes didn't care about fairness or timing, or the fact that their mother had died when he was 12, and their father had checked out emotionally years before that and physically 2 years ago. It just cared about insulin, about test strips, about endocrinologist appointments that cost $300 even with the insurance she barely qualified for. Stella had become his guardian at 23. She dropped out of NYU with 1 semester left in her economics degree, taken the first job that paid cash daily, and learned very quickly that survival was a full-time occupation that left no room for dreams. La Couronne had seemed like a miracle 7 months ago. Fred Hinkle had interviewed her in the restaurant's back office, a cramped room that smelled like printer toner and desperation. He'd been charming then. Asked about her experience, she'd lied and said she had more than she did. Asked about her availability, she'd said completely open, which was true. Asked if she could handle the pressure of serving Manhattan's most demanding clientele. "I can handle anything," she'd told him. He'd smiled. "I believe you." The pay was nearly double what she'd been making at the diner in Queens. The tips were triple. She'd nearly cried when he'd offered her the position. "There's just one thing," Fred had said, standing up and moving around the desk to where she sat. He'd perched on the edge, too close, his cologne overwhelming. "La Couronne is a family. We take care of each other, support each other. I hope you'll let me support you, Stella." His hand had landed on her shoulder. Not aggressive. Not yet, just present. She'd understood immediately. Had recognized the architecture of the trap, even as it was being built around her. But Jamie needed his insulin. The landlord needed his rent, and her pride, while still intact, had learned to negotiate with necessity. "I appreciate that," she'd said, standing up and forcing him to pull his hand back. "When do I start?" The first month had been probationary. Fred had been patient. Friendly suggestions that they grab drinks after her shift. Compliments about how the uniform fit her. Questions about whether she lived alone, whether she had a boyfriend, whether she ever got lonely working such long hours. She deflected each one with the precision of someone who'd had practice. The second month, his patience had expired. "You know, Stella, I put my neck out hiring you." They'd been in the walk-in freezer, ostensibly checking inventory. His breath had made clouds in the cold air. "You didn't have the experience we usually require. I took a chance because I saw something special in you. I appreciate the opportunity," she'd said, not looking at him, counting wine bottles that didn't need counting. "I'd hate for this not to work out. For you to have to go back to wherever you were before." The threat was spoken in kindness. That's what made it effective. She'd turned to face him then, her expression carefully neutral. "What exactly are you asking me for, Fred?" He'd blinked, surprised by the directness. "I'm just saying, working relationships benefit from mutual understanding. From give and take. I give 8-hour shifts. You take my labor and pay me. That's the understanding." His face had hardened. "That's not how this industry works." "Then teach me," she'd said, and walked out of the freezer. The punishment had started the next shift. Table assignments in the worst section, the one near the kitchen doors where you got hit by every server coming through. Constant corrections about uniform standards, about service timing, about the way she spoke to guests, write-ups for infractions that didn't exist, public criticisms that made the other servers avoid her, afraid that association would make them targets too. Stella had absorbed it all without complaint. Because complaining required options, and she had none. La Couronne paid $18 an hour plus tips. On a good night, she walked with $400. On a great night, $600. She worked 4 shifts a week, sometimes 5 when someone called out, and every dollar went into the same 3 categories: rent, Jamie's medical supplies, and food. Nothing else existed. Not new clothes, not social life, not the degree she'd abandoned, not the future she'd imagined before responsibility had converted imagination into arithmetic. Fred had escalated over the months. The comments became more explicit, the accidental touches more frequent, the suggestions that she'd find work easier if she were more cooperative. And tonight, when she'd replaced that water glass exactly as instructed and he'd still found fault, she'd known what was coming. The slap had almost been a relief. At least violence was honest. Stella closed the refrigerator and looked at her reflection in the dark window. Purple bruise blooming, eyes exhausted. 25 years old and already ancient. Tomorrow she'd go back, because that's what survival looked like. Fred Hinkle lived in a doorman building in Murray Hill, the kind of address that impressed people who didn't know Manhattan real estate. 1 bedroom, 650 square feet, $3,800 a month that his salary barely covered. But the lobby had marble floors, and the doorman wore a uniform. And that's what mattered when you brought women home or told colleagues where you lived. Image was everything. Image was control. He poured himself 2 fingers of bourbon Blanton's, because he'd learned that brand names communicated sophistication, and settled into his leather armchair, the one positioned to face the window with its view of other people's lit apartments. His hand still tingled from the slap. Good. Physical discipline left an impression that words never could. Stella Hatch had needed that lesson for months. Fred swirled his bourbon, replaying the moment. The sound of impact, the way her head had turned, the immediate silence that had given him back the room's attention. Control established, authority reinforced. Sebastian Perez's face flickered through his memory, that unsettling stillness, those 2 words. "Sit down, Fred." He took a long drink. Perez had asked questions, standard questions, nothing threatening, just inquiries about Stella's employment, about Fred's management style, about La Couronne's standards. The conversation had lasted maybe 4 minutes before Perez had dismissed him with a nod, and Fred had returned to his duties like nothing had happened, because nothing had happened. Men like Sebastian Perez didn't concern themselves with staff management. They had larger problems, shipments, territories, politicians who needed convincing. A floor manager disciplining a subordinate wasn't even on their radar. If anything, Perez probably respected the decisiveness. Alpha males recognized each other. Fred finished his bourbon and poured another. The problem with Stella Hatch, and he'd identified this within 2 weeks of hiring her, was that she didn't understand her position. She had the looks, dark hair, striking features, that lean body that the uniform displayed perfectly. She had the desperation. He'd seen it in her application, in the way she'd agreed to every shift he offered, in how she'd never once negotiated terms. She should have been easy. Instead, she'd become a project. Fred had spent 7 months teaching her the reality of their arrangement. Every woman who'd worked at La Couronne eventually learned the same lesson. Beauty was currency, and currency required investment. The servers who understood this, who accepted drinks after shifts, who laughed at his jokes, who let his hand linger on their lower backs, those women got the best sections, the highest profile tables, the shifts when big tippers came through. The ones who didn't understand either learned or left. Stella had done neither. She'd created a third category: silent resistance. Never overtly defiant that would have given him grounds for immediate termination. Instead, she'd perfected the art of technically perfect service delivered with absolute emotional absence. She followed every instruction, met every standard, gave him nothing to formally criticize while simultaneously denying him everything he actually wanted. It was infuriating. More than that, it was disrespectful. Fred stood and moved to the window, looking out at the city that had promised him so much and delivered so little. He'd worked in hospitality for 12 years. Started as a server himself at 22, convinced that charm and work ethic would carry him to restaurant ownership, to respect, to the life that men with lesser intelligence but better connections seemed to inherit. Instead, he'd plateaued at floor manager. Good enough to control the dining room but never good enough to make real money, to get invited to the backroom meetings, to sit at tables instead of hovering beside them. Men like Sebastian Perez were born into power. They didn't understand what it meant to fight for every inch of authority, to extract respect from people who'd otherwise ignore you. Fred had learned early that power wasn't given, it was taken, and it was maintained through consistent demonstration. Stella wasn't the first server he'd corrected publicly. 2 years ago, there'd been Rachel too chatty with the kitchen staff, too casual with the guests. He'd dressed her down in front of everyone, and within a week she'd quit. Good. Standards had to be maintained. Last year, Jennifer, pretty girl, terrible work ethic. He'd written her up 3 times before she'd finally understood that cooperation bought leniency. She'd lasted 6 more months before moving to Los Angeles. They'd parted on good terms. And now Stella, the stubborn one, the one who'd forced his hand tonight. His phone buzzed. Text from Raymond, the restaurant owner. Need to see you tomorrow, 10 a.m., my office. Fred stared at the message. Raymond never texted. He barely acknowledged Fred's existence beyond signing paychecks and reviewing quarterly numbers. Their communication was almost entirely one-directional. Fred sent reports. Raymond didn't respond. This was unusual, but not concerning. Raymond was old-school management hands-off until problems escalated beyond the floor, and tonight's incident, while dramatic, had been handled. The guests had returned to their meals. Service had continued. No complaints filed, no damage done. Probably just wanted to discuss the upcoming holiday bookings. Fred typed back, "Of course. See you then." He set his phone down and returned to his bourbon. Through the wall, he could hear his neighbor's television, some action movie with explosions that rattled the cheap drywall. $3,800 a month for walls you could punch through. His mind drifted back to Stella's face after the slap. That expression. Not hurt, not angry, just blank. Like she'd filed the incident away and moved on, while still standing in front of him. He didn't understand women like her. Women who didn't negotiate, didn't flirt, didn't use their assets. What was the point of being young and attractive if you weren't going to leverage it? She worked 70-hour weeks for what? To go home to whatever studio apartment she could barely afford and do it again the next day? It was wasteful. It was stupid. And it was disrespectful to men like him who were offering her an easier path. Fred had been patient. He'd given her months to come around, to understand how things worked. Tonight had simply been the consequence of her continued refusal to learn. Tomorrow he'd go to the meeting with Raymond, explain the situation if necessary, and continue running La Couronne the way it needed to be run with clear hierarchy and consistent discipline. Men like Sebastian Perez might own the city's shadows, but Fred Hinkle controlled his dining room. And that was power enough. He finished his second bourbon and went to bed, sleeping soundly for the first time in weeks. Sebastian Perez didn't sleep much. Not from insomnia or anxiety, those were luxuries that required uncertainty, and Sebastian had stopped being uncertain about anything 15 years ago. He simply didn't need rest the way other men did. 4 hours was sufficient. More than that felt like wasted time. At 3:30 a.m., he sat in the study of his Tribeca penthouse, a glass of water on the desk beside him, reviewing contracts that wouldn't exist by morning. Not because they'd be signed, because they'd be unnecessary. The parties involved would reach an understanding before sunrise, the kind that didn't require lawyers or signatures, just clarity about consequences. But his mind kept returning to La Couronne, to the sound of that slap, to Stella Hatch's absolute stillness afterward. Sebastian had built his reputation on observation. While other men in his position relied on violence or theatrics, he'd learned early that power came from seeing what others missed. The micro-expressions that revealed lies, the body language that exposed fear, the silences that communicated more than any confession. Most people, when struck, followed predictable patterns. They cried, which was submission. They fought back, which was ego. They apologized, which was survival instinct. They fled, which was self-preservation. Stella Hatch had done none of those things. She'd absorbed the blow, adjusted her uniform, and waited for instruction. That was training. Military-grade self-control. The kind of discipline you didn't develop from reading books or attending seminars, you developed it from surviving situations where reaction meant death and patience meant tomorrow. Sebastian had seen it before. In soldiers, in undercover operatives, in people who'd learned that emotional display was a liability they couldn't afford. What the hell was a woman with that level of control doing serving water at La Couronne? He opened his laptop and typed her name into the search bar connected to databases most people didn't know existed. The results populated in seconds. Stella Marie Hatch, age 25, Washington Heights address. No criminal record, no military service. NYU enrollment 2018 to 2021. Withdrew without completing degree. One dependent, Jamie Hatch, age 17, brother, type 1 diabetic. Sebastian clicked through the financial records, the ones that weren't technically legal to access but were available to men who paid the right people. Credit score, 680, barely functional. Medical debt, $47,000, all related to the brother's care. Student loans, $31,000. Monthly income from La Couronne, approximately $4,800, $6,200 depending on tips. Monthly expenses, $2,000, $100 rent, $800 insulin and supplies, $400 food, $200 utilities, $350 minimum debt payments. She was living on a knife's edge. One bad month, one injury, one missed shift, one surprise expense, and the entire structure collapsed, and Fred Hinkle knew it. Sebastian closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair. The numbers told a story more clearly than any testimony could. Stella Hatch wasn't working at La Couronne because she wanted to. She was working there because Fred Hinkle had offered her a lifeline when she was drowning, then spent 7 months trying to extract payment for his mercy. Classic predator economics. Find the desperate, offer rescue, demand interest. Sebastian had seen it 1,000 times in his world: loan sharks, corrupt landlords, employers who held visas over immigrant workers' heads. The mechanics were always the same. Identify vulnerability, create dependency, exploit leverage. Fred Hinkle had made one critical miscalculation, though. He'd assumed that desperation equaled weakness. Sebastian stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Hudson. The city was still dark, the river a black ribbon reflecting scattered lights. Somewhere out there, Stella Hatch was probably awake too, calculating her own numbers, figuring out how to make the math work for another month. He respected that. Respected the mathematics of survival, the cold pragmatism required to sacrifice pride for continuation. Most people couldn't do it. They'd rather collapse dramatically than endure methodically, but respect wasn't the same as intervention. Sebastian's world operated on clear principles. He didn't involve himself in civilian matters, didn't play hero, didn't rescue people from their own choices. His focus was on maintaining order within his sphere of influence, ensuring that agreements were honored, that territory was respected, that challenges to his authority were met with proportional response. A floor manager abusing his staff wasn't Sebastian's problem, except it had happened in front of him. In a restaurant where Sebastian's presence meant something, where his patronage provided legitimacy, where his approval translated to safety, La Couronne existed in the gray space between legitimate business and criminal enterprise, a neutral ground where deals could be discussed without surveillance, where men could eat dinner without worrying about federal wiretaps. Sebastian's continued presence at La Couronne was an endorsement, an implicit guarantee that the establishment operated under certain protections, and Fred Hinkle had committed assault in that protected space, had assumed that Sebastian wouldn't notice or wouldn't care. That assumption required correction. Sebastian returned to his desk and made a phone call. It was answered on the first ring despite the hour. Yes? The voice belonged to Gregor, his head of security and the man who'd been sitting 2 tables away at La Couronne, watching the room while Sebastian dined. The floor manager at La Couronne, Fred Hinkle. I need full background by noon. Employment history, financial records, criminal record if any, known associates, patterns of behavior. Understood. And the server? Stella Hatch. Same information. A pause. Both files? Yes. Should I? Just information. Nothing else yet. Understood. Sebastian ended the call and checked his watch. 4:17 a.m. In 6 hours, he had a meeting with a city councilman who'd been accepting bribes from a rival organization. That situation required careful handling. The councilman was useful, but needed to understand whose protection he actually operated under. After that, a lunch with his accountant to discuss the quarterly reports from his legitimate businesses. The restaurants, the construction company, the consulting firm that didn't actually consult but provided excellent money laundering infrastructure. Then at 3 p.m., he'd receive Gregor's files and decide what, if anything, Fred Hinkle's correction would look like. Sebastian didn't make impulsive decisions. Impulse was for men who didn't understand that every action created ripples, and ripples could become waves if you weren't paying attention. But he'd already made one decision, even if he hadn't articulated it yet. Fred Hinkle had revealed himself as a particular type of predator, the kind that operated in plain sight, that weaponized authority, that mistook institutional position for actual power. Men like that created instability. They made people desperate, and desperate people made unpredictable choices. They damaged the social infrastructure that allowed places like La Couronne to function, and Sebastian Perez didn't tolerate threats to infrastructure. Not from rivals, not from law enforcement, and certainly not from middle management sociopaths who thought slapping a waitress demonstrated strength. He finished his water and stood. The city was beginning to lighten that gray pre-dawn that came before actual sunrise. In a few hours, millions of people would wake up and go to work, most of them never knowing how close they lived to the machinery that actually ran things. Stella Hatch knew, though. She'd been living inside that machinery for 7 months. And tonight, Sebastian thought, she'd finally attracted the attention of someone who understood exactly how it worked. Sebastian arrived at La Couronne at 6:45 p.m. the following evening, exactly 15 minutes before his usual reservation time. The early arrival was deliberate. He wanted to observe the pre-dinner choreography, how the staff moved, how Fred Hinkle operated when he thought no one important was watching. Gregor had delivered the files at noon, and Sebastian had spent 2 hours reading them in his office while his lunch grew cold. Fred Hinkle's background was exactly what Sebastian had expected. A pattern of complaints from former employees at 3 previous restaurants, all withdrawn or settled quietly. 2 harassment claims that disappeared after the women stopped showing up for mediation. Financial records showing a man living slightly beyond his means, constantly leveraging credit to maintain an image he couldn't actually afford. A predator operating in the open because he'd learned that institutions protected men in his position more reliably than they protected the people he targeted. Stella Hatch's file was different. Straight-A student through high school, full scholarship to NYU. Economics major with a 3.8 gigapascals until her mother's death, then a gradual decline as she took on more work hours. Complete withdrawal spring semester 2021, 3 months after her father abandoned the family. Custody petition for her brother filed 2 weeks later. Every job since then had been survival-focused, highest pay, most hours, fastest tips, no criminal record, no drama. Just a 25-year-old woman moving through the world like someone crossing a frozen lake, every step carefully tested before committing weight. Sebastian watched through the restaurant's front windows as servers prepared for evening service. White uniforms moving efficiently through the dining room, adjusting place settings, folding napkins, checking candles. Fred Hinkle stood near the host stand, clipboard in hand, correcting a young server whose face had gone pale under his attention. Stella wasn't visible yet. Sebastian entered through the main doors. The hostess, a blonde woman in her 30s named Patricia, smiled with recognition. "Mr. Perez, good evening. Your table is ready. I need a few minutes first. Is Raymond here?" Patricia's smile flickered. "Mr. Castellanos is in his office. Shall I just tell him I'm here?" Sebastian didn't wait for a response. He walked past the host stand, past Fred Hinkle, who straightened immediately with that desperate brightness people used when they wanted acknowledgement, and through the door marked "Private" that led to the administrative offices. Raymond Castellanos was 73 years old and looked like someone who'd spent 5 decades in the restaurant business. Expensive suit that couldn't hide the stress, weight, gray hair that cost $200 to maintain, and eyes that had seen every kind of human behavior and stopped being surprised by any of it. He looked up from his desk as Sebastian entered without knocking. "Sebastian." No surprise in his voice. Men in Raymond's position learned early that surprise was unprofessional. "I wasn't expecting you until 7. We need to talk about your floor manager." Raymond's expression didn't change, but his hand stopped moving across the paperwork in front of him. "I assume you mean last night's incident. You saw it? I reviewed the security footage this morning." Raymond gestured to the chair across from his desk. Sebastian remained standing. "I've already scheduled a meeting with Fred to discuss appropriate disciplinary measures." "When?" "This morning. 10 o'clock. He should be arriving." Raymond checked his watch. "He was supposed to be here 3 hours ago, actually. He hasn't responded to calls or messages." Sebastian processed that information without visible reaction. Fred's absence wasn't surprising. Men who'd overplayed their hand often went to ground when they realized their protection wasn't as solid as they'd assumed. "The server," Sebastian said. "Stella Hatch. Is she working tonight?" "Yes. She's in the changing room now." "Sebastian, I want you to know that I take incidents like last night extremely seriously. La Couronne has maintained its reputation for 40 years because I want to speak with her." Raymond stopped mid-sentence. The office fell silent except for the muted sounds of the dining room being prepared beyond the walls. When he spoke again, his voice carried a caution that hadn't been there before. "Of course. Should I have Patricia bring her here?" "No. Somewhere private. Not your office." Raymond stood slowly. "The wine cellar is empty this time of evening. I can have her meet you there." Sebastian nodded once and left without another word. The wine cellar at La Couronne was climate-controlled perfection. Rows of bottles organized by region and vintage, soft lighting that made the labels glow, and absolute silence. It was also the one place in the restaurant without security cameras, a fact that both Raymond and Sebastian were aware of. Sebastian stood near the back wall, studying a 1982 Chateau Petrus, when he heard the door open. Stella descended the stairs carefully, still in her white uniform, the purple bruise on her cheek now edged with yellow. She stopped at the bottom, maintaining distance, her hands loose at her sides. "Mr. Castellanos said you wanted to see me." Her voice was steady, professional, exactly what the situation required and nothing more. Sebastian turned to face her. "Do you know who I am?" "Yes." "Then you understand this conversation is private." "Yes." He studied her the way he'd studied her last night: posture, breathing, the micro-adjustments people made under pressure. She stood like someone accustomed to being evaluated, neither defensive nor performing, just present. "How long has Fred Hinkle been harassing you?" No preamble, no gentle approach, just the question. Stella's expression didn't change. "Since he hired me." "Sexually?" "Yes." "Has he touched you before last night?" She met his eyes directly. Most people couldn't maintain eye contact with Sebastian for more than a few seconds. Stella held it without effort. "He tried. Once. In the walk-in freezer. 2nd month I worked here. I made it clear that if he touched me again, I'd make it expensive for him." "How?" "I'd document everything, file complaints with every agency that would listen, make enough noise that La Couronne's reputation and his would suffer permanent damage." She paused. "I told him I had nothing to lose. That scared him more than any threat of violence would have." Sebastian almost smiled. "Almost. Why didn't you follow through after last night?" "Because filing complaints requires time I don't have, and money I can't spare. Because the system protects men like Fred Hinkle more reliably than it protects women like me. And because I've learned that survival sometimes means absorbing hits that other people think you should fight." The honesty was absolute. No performance, no appeal for sympathy. Just cold assessment of her reality. "Why do you stay?" Sebastian asked. Because I have a 17-year-old brother who needs $800 worth of insulin every month, and La Couronne pays me enough to keep him alive. Silence filled the wine cellar. Somewhere above them, the dinner service was beginning. Voices, footsteps, the orchestrated chaos of expensive hospitality. Sebastian walked closer, stopping at a distance that was professional but present. Has he touched you before last night? No, he learned. Those two words carried more violence than any threat could have. Sebastian nodded once, his decision crystallizing. You won't see Fred Hinkle again. Stella's expression flickered not with relief, but with calculation. What does that mean? It means exactly what I said. And what do you want in return? Smart question. The kind that someone who'd spent 7 months being leveraged would ask automatically. Nothing, Sebastian said. This isn't a transaction. Everything's a transaction. Not this. He turned and walked toward the stairs, then stopped. When you go back upstairs, work your shift normally. If anyone asks about this conversation, tell them I was inquiring about the wine selection, and if Fred comes back, he won't. Sebastian climbed the stairs without waiting for a response, leaving Stella alone in the wine cellar with the truth neither of them had spoken aloud. Fred Hinkle's life, as he knew it, had ended the moment he'd raised his hand in Sebastian Perez's presence. The only question remaining was how much of Fred would be left when Sebastian finished with him. Fred Hinkle arrived at La Couronne at 6:55 p.m., 5 minutes before service officially began. His confidence rebuilt after a day spent convincing himself that Raymond's morning summons had been nothing more than routine management theater. He'd ignored the calls and messages deliberately. Making Raymond wait was a small power play, but power plays mattered. They established that Fred Hinkle wasn't some frightened employee who jumped at every administrative request. He was a professional who operated on his own schedule. The dining room was already filling early reservations, the guests who preferred to eat before the theater crowd arrived. Fred scanned the room with practiced efficiency, noting table assignments, identifying high-profile guests who'd require extra attention. Table 7 was occupied. Sebastian Perez sat in his usual position, wearing another black suit, his scotch untouched in front of him. He was reading something on his phone, apparently uninterested in the room around him. Fred felt a small surge of relief. Whatever concern he'd manufactured about last night's interaction dissolved. If Perez had been bothered, he wouldn't have returned. His presence was endorsement, approval. Fred. He turned. Patricia stood behind the host stand, her expression unreadable. Mr. Castellanos wants to see you. Immediately. Fred checked his watch with theatrical irritation. We're about to start service. Can it wait 30 minutes? He said immediately. Something in her tone made Fred pause, but he forced a smile. Of course. Tell him I'll be right there. He adjusted his tie and headed toward the administrative offices, mentally preparing his explanation for the morning's absence. A family emergency, completely unavoidable. He'd been meaning to call, but the situation had been so consuming. Raymond's office door was open. Fred stepped inside and stopped. Raymond sat behind his desk, but he wasn't alone. 2 men in suits stood against the wall, not restaurant staff, not guests. Their posture was too alert, their attention too focused. Security, Fred realized, but not La Couronne's usual security. Close the door, Fred, Raymond said. Fred obeyed, his confidence beginning to fracture. Raymond, I apologize for this morning. There was a situation with my... Sit down. The command was flat, non-negotiable. Fred sat. Raymond folded his hands on the desk, studying Fred with an expression that resembled a doctor about to deliver a terminal diagnosis. You've been employed at La Couronne for 2 years and 4 months. In that time, I've received exactly 7 complaints about your conduct, all from female staff members, all withdrawn before formal proceedings. Fred's throat tightened. I don't know what you've been told, but I reviewed the security footage from last night, multiple angles. I saw you strike Stella Hatch in the middle of dinner service over a fabricated infraction. She was insubordinate. I maintained discipline standards that... I also had my attorney review your previous employment history. Did you know that settlement agreements are discoverable during due diligence investigations? The 2 harassment claims from your previous positions? I have copies of both, including the one involving a 19-year-old hostess who you cornered in a storage closet. The room tilted. Fred gripped the arms of his chair. Those were settled. Confidentially. You can't. I can do whatever I want, Fred. This is my restaurant. Raymond opened a folder and slid a single document across the desk. Your employment is terminated effective immediately. You'll receive 2 weeks severance as required by your contract, but nothing additional. Your access to the building is revoked. Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings, and then you'll leave. Fred stared at the termination letter, his mind racing. This was wrong. This was an overreaction. One incident, one moment of necessary discipline, and Raymond was destroying his career? This is because of Sebastian Perez, Fred said, his voice hardening. He complained. One of your guests, someone who probably has his own. Mr. Perez didn't complain, Raymond interrupted. He inquired. He asked questions about your employment history and your management style. I conducted my own investigation based on those questions and didn't like what I found. I want to speak to a lawyer. You're welcome to. The termination is legal and documented. But Fred? Raymond leaned forward. If you pursue any action against La Couronne, I will ensure that every restaurant in this city knows exactly why you were fired. I will personally call every owner I know, and I know all of them, and I will tell them about the pattern of harassment, about the settlements, about last night's assault. Fred stood abruptly, his chair scraping backward. You can't blacklist me. That's illegal. It's not blacklisting. It's professional networking. It's me protecting my colleagues from a liability I failed to identify sooner. The two security men stepped away from the wall, positioning themselves between Fred and Raymond's desk. Get your belongings, Raymond said. You have 5 minutes. Fred moved through the administrative corridor in a daze, the security men flanking him like he was a criminal. His office, a closet-sized space with a desk and a filing cabinet, felt like a museum exhibit of a life that no longer existed. He grabbed his laptop, a framed photo of himself at some restaurant industry award ceremony, and a box of business cards that were now worthless. Time's up, one of the security men said. They escorted him through the kitchen staff, stopped working to watch, their expressions ranging from shock to barely concealed satisfaction, and toward the back exit that emptied into the alley. The front entrance, Fred protested. My car is... Back exit, the security man repeated. They pushed through the door into the alley. The evening air was cold, carrying the smell of garbage from the dumpsters that lined the narrow passage. Fred clutched his box of belongings, trying to process what had just happened. The door closed behind him with a heavy click, and then he heard footsteps. Fred turned. Sebastian Perez emerged from the shadows near the dumpsters, his black suit making him nearly invisible in the dim light. He wasn't alone. 3 men flanked him, Gregor, plus 2 others Fred didn't recognize. None of them were smiling. Mr. Perez, Fred said, his voice cracking. I don't know what Stella told you, but she's been problematic since. Stop talking. Sebastian's voice was quiet, almost conversational. Somehow that made it more terrifying than if he'd been shouting. You have a choice, Fred. You can leave Manhattan tonight. Find work in another city, another state. Start over somewhere that no one knows your name. Fred's heart hammered. Or I make a few phone calls to people who handle problems like you professionally, and you disappear in a way that raises questions no one will ever answer. Sebastian stepped closer. The alley suddenly felt airless. Do you understand what I'm offering you? Fred nodded, unable to speak. Say it out loud. I understand. You'll leave tonight? Yes. Sebastian studied him for a long moment, then gestured to Gregor. Make sure he gets to his apartment. Make sure he packs. Make sure he gets on a bus. I don't care where it's going. And make sure he understands that if he ever comes back to New York, the offer expires. Gregor nodded. Sebastian turned to leave, then paused. Fred, the woman you hit last night has more courage in her silence than you'll ever have in your entire life. Remember that when you're explaining to yourself how you ended up wherever you end up. He walked away, disappearing into the shadows. Gregor grabbed Fred's arm. Let's go. As they pulled him toward a waiting car, Fred Hinkle realized he was crying, not from fear. From the sudden, crushing understanding that he'd never actually had power at all. He'd just been allowed to pretend. Until someone who understood real power decided the pretending was over. The news spread through La Couronne's staff with the velocity of wildfire in drought season. By 7:15 p.m., every server knew that Fred Hinkle had been escorted out through the kitchen. By 7:30, the line cooks had heard he'd been fired. By 8, when Stella returned from the wine cellar and resumed her section, the entire restaurant understood that something seismic had shifted in the building's foundation. What they didn't know, what they could only speculate about in hurried whispers near the coffee station, was why. Stella moved through her tables with the same efficient precision she always had. Table 14 needed water refills. Table 16 had questions about the halibut preparation. Table 11 wanted recommendations for dessert wine, She delivered each interaction with professional courtesy, her bruised cheek visible under the soft lighting but her demeanor unchanged. The other servers watched her differently now. Jessica, who'd worked at La Couronne for 3 years and had learned to avoid Fred's attention through strategic invisibility, approached Stella near the kitchen doors. "Is it true?" she whispered. "That he's actually gone?" Stella didn't slow her movement, didn't acknowledge the question as significant. "That's what I heard. Did you?" Jessica stopped, recalibrating. "Did something happen?" "He got fired for violating restaurant policy." Stella's voice was flat, factual. "That's all I know." It wasn't all she knew, but it was all she was willing to say. Jessica nodded slowly, processing. "I'm glad he was." She couldn't finish the sentence, didn't need to. Stella touched her arm briefly, the gesture lasting less than a second, then continued to her section. At table 7, Sebastian Perez was dining alone. He'd ordered the ribeye, medium rare, but had barely touched it. His attention appeared focused on his phone, scrolling through messages. But Stella had worked in service long enough to recognize performative disinterest. He was listening to everything. She approached with the water pitcher. "Can I refill your glass, Mr. Perez?" He glanced up briefly. "Please." She poured, her hand steady despite the weight of the afternoon's conversation still settling in her chest. Sebastian said nothing else, returned his attention to his phone, and Stella moved to the next table. But she'd seen his expression. Just for a moment, just in that brief glance, acknowledgement without words, confirmation without declaration, "You won't see Fred Hinkle again." He'd meant it. By 9 p.m., Raymond Castellanos emerged from his office and stood near the host stand, surveying the dining room with the careful assessment of someone conducting damage control. The evening service was proceeding normally. Guests ate, conversed, conducted their business. The incident from last night, the slap that had frozen the room, seemed distant now, irrelevant compared to the quality of the wine and the precision of the sear on their entrees. But Raymond knew better. He'd operated La Couronne for 40 years, and he understood that restaurants like his existed on reputation more than revenue. One viral video, one social media post, one guest with the wrong connections, sharing the wrong story, and 40 years of careful cultivation could evaporate in a weekend. Sebastian Perez's inquiry had been a gift, actually. A warning delivered gently enough to allow correction before consequences became permanent. Raymond caught Stella's eye as she passed. "Miss Hatch, a moment." She approached, her expression neutral. "Yes, Mr. Castellanos? I want to apologize for last night's incident. It was inexcusable, and it should never have happened in my establishment." Stella studied him with eyes that Raymond suddenly realized were far more perceptive than he'd given her credit for. "Thank you. I've terminated Mr. Hinkle's employment. He won't be returning." "I heard." Raymond hesitated. Apologies were strategic in his world, calculated to achieve specific outcomes. But something about Stella's stillness made strategy feel inadequate. "You've been working here for 7 months, he said. "In that time, you've maintained perfect service standards despite—" He stopped. "Despite harassment, despite abuse, despite conditions that would have made most employees quit or file lawsuits, despite difficult circumstances." "I need the job," Stella said simply. "I'm increasing your hourly rate to $22, effective immediately, and I'm moving you to Section A." Section A was where the highest profile guests sat, the tables that generated $500 tips on a regular Tuesday, the territory that servers fought for through seniority and favoritism. Stella's expression flickered, surprise quickly controlled. "That's not necessary. It's not a favor. It's a correction. You should have been there months ago." But Fred controlled table assignments and Raymond stopped again. "You've earned it." She nodded once. "Thank you, Mr. Castellanos." He dismissed her with a gesture, watching as she returned to her section. Around the dining room, other staff members had witnessed the conversation. They understood what it meant. Stella Hatch was untouchable now. At 10:30 p.m., Sebastian Perez stood to leave. He placed cash on the table enough to cover his meal, plus a 30% tip, and buttoned his suit jacket. The dining room had thinned. Only a few tables remained, guests lingering over espresso and cognac. The dinner rush was over, the tension of service giving way to the quiet exhaustion that came at shift's end. Sebastian walked toward the exit, and the room responded to his movement with subtle adjustments. Conversations paused. Servers stepped aside. Even the guests who didn't know who he was understood that someone significant was departing. He stopped near the kitchen doors where Stella was entering an order into the computer system. "Miss Hatch." She turned, maintaining the professional distance that the situation required. "Yes, Mr. Perez, the wine recommendation you made last month. The 2015 Barolo. It was excellent." Stella blinked. She'd made that recommendation 6 weeks ago, a casual suggestion when he'd asked about pairings for the Osso Buco. She hadn't expected him to remember her. "I'm glad you enjoyed it." Sebastian nodded once, his expression unreadable. Then he did something that made every person within earshot stop what they were doing. He extended his hand. Stella looked at it for a fraction of a second, understanding the weight of the gesture, the visibility of it, what it meant for Sebastian Perez to offer a handshake to a server in the middle of La Couronne. She took his hand. The grip was firm, brief, professional. "If anyone here gives you trouble," Sebastian said quietly, his voice low enough that only Stella could hear clearly, "you have my number now. Patricia has it. Use it." He released her hand and walked toward the exit without waiting for a response. The front door closed behind him with a soft click. The dining room remained frozen for 3 full seconds. Then, slowly, service resumed. Conversations restarted. Orders were taken. But nothing felt the same, and everyone knew it. Jessica approached Stella at the coffee station, her eyes wide. "Did Sebastian Perez just shake your hand?" "Yes," Stella said, pouring herself water. "Do you know what that means?" Stella drank the entire glass before answering. "It means no one here will ever hit me again." Jessica stared at her. "How are you so calm about this?" "Because I've spent 7 months learning that panic is expensive and stillness is free." Stella set down the glass. "And because I have 4 more tables to close before I can go home." She returned to her section, moving with the same efficiency she always had. But inside, where no one could see, Stella Hatch allowed herself one small acknowledgement of what had just happened. She'd survived. Not just last night's slap, not just Fred Hinkle's months of harassment. She'd survived the entire system, designed to grind people like her into compliance. And for the first time in 7 months, she could breathe without calculating the cost. Stella's next shift was Thursday evening, 48 hours after Fred Hinkle had been escorted through the kitchen and out of La Couronne forever. She arrived at 4:45 p.m. for the 5 o'clock setup, using the staff entrance that opened into the narrow hallway lined with lockers and time clocks. The usual pre-shift sounds filled the space, servers changing into uniforms, kitchen staff prepping stations, the distant clatter of dishes being organized for evening service. But something was different. The conversation stopped when she entered. Not hostile silence. Not pitying silence. Something else entirely, a collective acknowledgement that couldn't be expressed through words but saturated the air like humidity before a storm. Jessica was tying her apron, her locker open beside Stella's. Hey, Stella replied, opening her own locker and retrieving her uniform. "Section A assignments are posted," Jessica said carefully. "You're on table 7. Stella paused mid-motion. Table 7 was Sebastian Perez's table, the power table, the position that every server with 3+ years seniority had been competing for since the restaurant opened. "Raymond told me about Section A," Stella said, pulling out her uniform. "I didn't realize he meant Table 7 and everything around it," Jessica interrupted. "Tables 5 through 9. The entire northwest corner. That's prime real estate." Michael, a server who'd worked at La Couronne for 5 years and had been angling for Section A since his 2nd month, appeared in the doorway. He was 43, professionally efficient, and had perfected the art of competitive courtesy. He looked at Stella without hostility. "Congratulations on the section assignment." Stella studied him, searching for sarcasm or resentment. Found neither. "Thank you." "Fred played favorites," Michael continued. "Gave sections based on personal preference instead of merit. Raymond's correcting that. You've earned it." He left before Stella could respond. Jessica leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Everyone knows what Fred did. Not just to you, to all of us. The constant corrections, the impossible standards, the way he'd humiliate people during rush." She paused. "No one's sad he's gone." Stella changed into her uniform without responding. Emotions were expensive, and she'd already spent too much energy processing the last few days. Relief was a luxury. So was satisfaction. Right now, she needed to focus on the immediate task, getting through another shift, earning another night's tips, keeping the mathematical equation of her survival balanced. She clocked in at 4:58 p.m. The evening service began exactly as it always did, guests arriving in waves. The host stand orchestrating table assignments, servers moving through their sections with practiced choreography, but the absence of Fred Hinkle created a vacuum that everyone felt without discussing. Raymond had assumed temporary floor management responsibilities, moving through the dining room with the measured authority of someone who'd done this job decades ago and could still do it when necessary. He didn't micromanage, didn't hover, didn't correct servers over imagined infractions. He simply ensured that standards were maintained and guests were satisfied. The difference was profound. Stella worked table 7 and its surrounding assignments with the same efficiency she'd brought to every shift, but without the constant surveillance she'd grown accustomed to. No one was watching her specifically. No one was inventing mistakes. No one was waiting for her to fail so they could document her inadequacy. She could just work. Table 7 remained empty until 7:30 p.m., when Sebastian Perez arrived with 2 associates men in expensive suits, who carried themselves with the controlled alertness of people accustomed to violence. They didn't speak loudly, didn't draw attention, but every staff member noticed their presence immediately. Stella approached with menus and water. "Good evening, Mr. Perez." Sebastian glanced up briefly. "Good evening, Miss Hatch." No extended conversation, no meaningful looks, just professional acknowledgement. She took their drink orders, scotch for Sebastian, vodka martinis for his associates, and returned to the bar. As she waited for the bartender to prepare the drinks, she caught Patricia watching her from the host stand. The older woman offered a small nod. Not congratulatory, just confirmation of something unspoken. Stella returned the nod and carried the drinks to table 7. By 9 p.m., the dining room had reached that post-rush equilibrium where guests lingered over dessert and final drinks, conversation softening into the satisfied exhaustion that came after good food and successful negotiations. Stella's tips for the evening were already approaching $400, and she still had 3 tables finishing their meals. Section A was everything the other servers had said. It would be high-profile guests, who tipped well, who understood restaurant etiquette, who didn't create problems because problems were beneath them. She was clearing table 8 when Raymond appeared beside her. "A moment," he said quietly. They stepped into the narrow alcove near the wine storage, away from guest visibility. Raymond held a manila envelope, his expression businesslike but not unkind. "Your pay increase is effective as of last shift," he said, handing her the envelope. "This contains the updated employment contract and documentation of your new section assignment. Standard Section A protocol includes priority scheduling and automatic inclusion in private event staffing, which pays additional hourly rates." Stella opened the envelope, scanning the contract. $22 hourly, Section A designation, priority scheduling that guaranteed minimum 4 shifts weekly. The math recalculated instantly in her mind. Base pay increase of $640 monthly. Tips in Section A averaging $500 nightly instead of $350. Private events adding potential $200 $300 weekly. Her financial equation had just shifted from barely sustainable to actually manageable. "Thank you," she said, meaning it more than Raymond could understand. "You've been a model employee despite challenging circumstances," Raymond replied. "That's not common. Most people either quit or become problems themselves. You did neither." He paused, and something in his expression softened slightly. "Fred Hinkle created a toxic environment that I should have identified and corrected sooner. That failure is mine, not yours. This," he gestured to the envelope, "is not compensation for what you endured. It's what you should have had from the beginning." Stella nodded once. "I understand. If you ever have concerns about working conditions or treatment from staff or guests, you come directly to me. Not a manager. Me. Is that clear?" "Yes, Mr. Castellanos." He dismissed her with a slight gesture, and Stella returned to her section. Table 7 was settling their bill. Sebastian had left cash as always, enough to cover the meal plus 30%. His associates had already departed, and he was buttoning his suit jacket, preparing to leave. He caught her eye across the dining room, didn't smile, didn't gesture, just maintained eye contact for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to communicate acknowledgement, brief enough to avoid creating spectacle. Then he walked toward the exit and disappeared into the Manhattan night. Stella cleared table 7, pocketing the tip and resetting the table for tomorrow's service. Her cheek still ached where the bruise was fading. Her feet hurt from 8 hours of constant movement. Her exhaustion was the kind that would take more than one good night's sleep to resolve. But for the first time in 7 months, she wasn't calculating how many more shifts she could endure before something inside her broke. She was calculating how much money she could save now that the equation had finally shifted in her favor. And that difference between enduring and building felt like breathing after being underwater too long. Fred Hinkle's apartment in Murray Hill sat empty for 3 days before the landlord noticed. The doorman, a retired cop named Luis who'd worked the building for 12 years, mentioned it to the building manager on Monday morning. "That guy in 4F? The one who always wanted me to remember his name? Haven't seen him since Thursday." The building manager, more concerned with lease violations than tenant welfare, checked the records. Rent was paid through the end of the month. No complaints filed. No reason to investigate. Fred's absence created a small void in the building's ecosystem that closed almost immediately. The yoga instructor in 4G stopped hearing his television through the walls. The couple in 4E no longer encountered him in the hallway, making observations about the wife's appearance that her husband pretended not to hear. The building improved marginally through subtraction. At La Couronne, Fred's absence was more complicated. The staff had questions that Raymond Castellanos answered with carefully calibrated transparency. Fred had been terminated for violations of restaurant policy and professional conduct standards. The decision was final. No, he would not be returning. Yes, the restaurant was reviewing internal procedures to prevent similar situations. What Raymond didn't say, what he couldn't say without inviting legal complications, was that Fred Hinkle had been given a choice between voluntary disappearance and involuntary consequences, and had chosen the former. Where Fred went wasn't Raymond's concern. That he was gone permanently was all that mattered. The servers processed this information according to their individual experiences with Fred's management style. Those who'd been targets felt relief so profound it manifested physically, shoulders relaxing, smiles coming easier, the constant vigilance finally unnecessary. Those who'd avoided his attention through compliance felt guilt that they quickly suppressed. Those who'd never experienced his harassment directly felt nothing at all. Jessica confided in Stella during a quiet moment near the coffee station. "I keep expecting him to walk through the door. Like this is temporary and he'll come back and everything will go back to how it was." "He won't," Stella said with certainty that came from places Jessica didn't have access to. "How do you know?" "Because men like Sebastian Perez don't make suggestions. They make decisions. And when they decide something is finished, it's finished." Jessica studied her friend's face, the fading bruise, the steady eyes, the absence of fear that had characterized Stella's demeanor since the incident. "Did he threaten Fred? Did something happen that we don't know about?" Stella poured herself coffee, considering how much truth was appropriate. "I don't know the specifics. But I know that Fred understood his options, and he chose to leave." "What were his options?" "Leave or face consequences he couldn't survive." Stella met Jessica's eyes. "That's all I know. That's all I need to know." Rumors circulated through the restaurant industry's informal networks with the speed that only gossip between professional service workers could achieve. Fred Hinkle had been fired from La Couronne. The reasons varied depending on who was telling the story. Sexual harassment, financial misconduct, drug use, theft. None of the rumors were entirely accurate, but all of them shared the same conclusion. Fred was unemployable now. At Brasserie Lillet, where Fred had worked 3 years ago, the former general manager heard the news and nodded with grim satisfaction. Took long enough. He was a problem there too. At Meridian, where Fred had lasted 18 months before abruptly resigning, 2 servers exchanged knowing looks. "Remember that hostess who quit after 3 weeks? The one who wouldn't say why? Rachel." "Yeah. I wonder if she knows." The hospitality industry was small enough that reputations traveled faster than resumes. By the end of the week, Fred Hinkle's professional prospects in Manhattan had evaporated completely. On Saturday evening, exactly 1 week after the incident, Sebastian Perez received a call from Gregor. "The situation is resolved," Gregor said without preamble. He purchased a bus ticket to Philadelphia. Arrived Thursday morning. Last known location was a budget hotel near the Greyhound station. No credit card activity since Friday. No phone calls. No social media activity. He understood the terms? Completely. I explained that returning to New York would void all protections. Sebastian processed this information while reviewing contracts in his Tribeca study. Fred Hinkle's fate didn't require further consideration. The man had been offered mercy in the form of exile, and whether he survived that exile was his own concern. "And the other matter?" Sebastian asked. "Miss Hatch's financial situation has stabilized. The pay increase and section reassignment have improved her monthly income by approximately 40%. Debt payments are current. Brother's medical supplies are secured." Sebastian nodded, though Gregor couldn't see him. "That's all." He ended the call. Fred Hinkle existed now only as a cautionary tale, not because of what Sebastian had done to him, but because of what Sebastian hadn't needed to do. Real power didn't require violence. It required clarity about consequences and the will to enforce them. Fred had learned that lesson in the alley behind La Couronne, had carried that lesson to Philadelphia, and would carry it wherever he went next, assuming he went anywhere. Sebastian returned to his contracts. The matter was closed. La Couronne continued. Guests arrived each evening expecting excellence and received it. Deals were negotiated over seared scallops and aged ribeye. Money changed hands through conversations that never mentioned specific numbers. The city's power structure used the restaurant the way it had always been used, as neutral territory, where agreements could be reached and relationships could be maintained. The staff adapted to Fred Hinkle's absence the way ecosystems adapt to the removal of invasive species, quickly, gratefully, and with improved overall function. Raymond promoted Michael to assistant floor manager, a position that came with modest authority and significant responsibility. Michael approached the role with the professionalism of someone who understood that management was service to staff, not power over them. The difference was transformative. Servers reported feeling heard. Problems were addressed before they escalated. The toxic atmosphere that had characterized Fred's tenure dissolved into something approaching genuine teamwork. Stella worked her Section A assignments with the same efficient precision she'd brought to every shift, but without the constant calculation of threat. Her tips remained excellent. Her schedule stabilized. The math of her survival shifted from desperate to sustainable. Jamie's insulin was never at risk. Rent was never late. The suffocating pressure that had defined the last 7 months finally loosened enough that she could occasionally imagine a future beyond next month's bills. She didn't allow herself to relax completely. Relaxation required trust, and trust required time she hadn't earned yet, but she could breathe without measuring the cost of each breath, and that was progress. Sebastian Perez continued dining at La Couronne every Tuesday and Thursday, his presence as regular as the chandeliers and as predictable as the evening service schedule. He never referenced the incident with Fred Hinkle, never asked Stella about her improved circumstances, never sought acknowledgement or gratitude for his intervention. He simply existed in the space, conducting his business, maintaining his routines, and through his presence alone ensuring that certain standards were maintained and certain behaviors remained unacceptable. The message was clear to everyone who understood how power actually functioned. La Couronne operated under specific protections, and those protections extended to the people who worked there. Stella served his table without ceremony, took his orders, delivered his meals, cleared his plates. Their interactions remained professional, brief, and devoid of the weight that outsiders might have expected given what had transpired. But everyone who worked at La Couronne understood what Sebastian's continued patronage meant. It meant that what happened to Fred Hinkle wasn't an aberration. It was a precedent. It meant that certain lines, once clearly established, would be enforced without negotiation. It meant that the people who served Manhattan's elite were not invisible, were not disposable, were not acceptable targets for those who mistook institutional position for actual power. 3 months after Fred Hinkle's termination, a new floor manager arrived at La Couronne. His name was David Toney, and he came with impeccable references from 2 Michelin-starred establishments and a management philosophy that prioritized staff development over authoritarian control. On his second day, Raymond pulled him aside for a private conversation in the office. "There are certain standards at La Couronne that go beyond service excellence," Raymond said, his tone carrying the weight of recent experience. "How you treat staff isn't just an internal matter. It's a reflection of this establishment's values and a signal to the guests about what kind of business we operate." David nodded, his expression attentive. "We had a situation recently," Raymond continued carefully. "A manager who created a hostile environment. It was addressed permanently. I tell you this not as gossip, but as context. The people who work here are not expendable. They are not interchangeable. They are skilled professionals who deserve respect and protection." "I understand completely," David said. "I hope you do. Because one of our regular guests takes that standard very seriously, and his attention, once earned, is never forgotten." Raymond didn't need to specify which guest. David had already been briefed on the VIP list, had already noted which tables required particular care, had already understood that Table 7 represented something beyond a mere seating assignment. He'd understood before accepting the position that La Couronne operated in spaces where conventional rules were supplemented by unconventional enforcement. That understanding was part of why he'd been hired. On a Tuesday evening in late autumn, Stella was clearing Table 7 after Sebastian and his associates had departed. The tip was generous as always, 35%, cash, exact calculation that required no counting. As she collected the bills, she noticed something beneath Sebastian's Scotch glass. A business card. Simple, minimalist design, no company name, just a phone number embossed in black ink. Stella picked it up, turning it over. The back was blank. She understood immediately. This wasn't an invitation for conversation, it was insurance. A direct line that bypassed intermediaries and gatekeepers, to be used only if the protections she'd been granted ever failed. She slipped the card into her apron pocket and finished clearing the table. That night, after her shift ended and she'd changed out of her uniform, Stella stood outside La Couronne for a moment before heading to the subway. The city moved around her with its usual relentless energy, taxis honking, people rushing, the ambient noise of millions of lives intersecting briefly before diverging again. She'd lived here her entire life but had rarely felt part of it, had always existed in the margins, working to survive rather than living to thrive. But tonight, standing on the sidewalk with a business card in her pocket and $480 in tips secured in her bag, Stella Hatch allowed herself a moment of acknowledgement. She'd survived Fred Hinkle. She'd survived the system designed to grind people like her into compliance. She'd absorbed violence without breaking, had maintained dignity without surrendering, had endured without becoming bitter, and she'd caught the attention of someone who understood that survival of that caliber deserved recognition. Not rescue, recognition. The difference mattered. Stella walked to the subway, descended into the underground, and headed home to her brother, her tiny apartment, and her carefully balanced equation of survival that had finally shifted towards sustainability. Behind her, La Couronne's lights glowed warm against the Manhattan night. Inside, the evening service continued. Guests dined, deals were negotiated, power circulated through quiet conversations and understood hierarchies. And at table 7, empty now but permanently marked by what had transpired there, a new rule had been established through enforcement rather than declaration. If Sebastian Perez noticed you once, he would never forget you. And everyone who worked at La Couronne, everyone who dined there, everyone who existed in the ecosystem that the restaurant represented, understood exactly what that meant. Protection for those who deserved it, consequences for those who didn't, and absolute clarity about which category you occupied. The city continued its relentless motion, indifferent to individual stories but shaped by them nonetheless, and Stella Hatch walked through it no longer invisible. Thanks for staying with this story right till the final moment. You're the reason these stories come alive. If you're ready for another powerful journey, just tap the next video on your screen. And before you go, leave a quick comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I'm excited to see your thoughts and connect with you down there.